Alexei Gusev is the associate professor of history of the Moscow Lomonosov State University, expert of the Global Labor Institute. He is the author of more than 80 publications on the history of socialist and labor movements, Trotskyism and communist oppositions, social and political history of Russia, historiography and political theory. From the 1980s, he has been active in labor, socialist and democratic movements, co-founder of the Victor Serge Public Library in Moscow, Praxis Research and Education Center, University Solidarity Union. The Kronstadt Revolt of 1921 is part of the Great Russian Revolution. On the 100th anniversary of the Kronstadt events, on March 8, 1921, Izvestia of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee of Kronstadt's sailors, Red Army soldiers, and workers published the declaration, "What are we fighting for?" where the nature of Kronstadt revolt against Communist Party dictatorship was defined in the following way, quote, "Here in Kronstadt has been laid the first stone of the Third Revolution, striking the last fetters from the laboring masses and opening a broad new road for socialist creativity. This new revolution will also rouse the laboring masses of the East and of the West by serving as an example of the new socialist construction as opposed to bureaucratic communist, quote, creativity," end quote. Thus, the March Revolution of 1921, initiated by Red Kronstadt, had to complete the cause of the February and October revolutions of 1917. But not only rebels used the notion of the Third Revolution. A day before, on March 7th, a representative of the opposite side, plenipotentiary of the special section of the All-Russian Cheka, Vasily Savai, reported to War Commissar Leon Trotsky, quote, "These sailors of the Baltic Fleet were and still are professional revolutionaries and could well form the basis for a possible third revolution," end quote. Was the third revolution just a rhetorical phrase, or had any real foundations in 1921? If revolution is understood as a process of social transformations, developing under an influence of mass popular actions, and involving changes of political regimes, then the events from 1917 to 1921 constitute the Great Russian Revolution that consisted of several phases. It was caused by the objective need to resolve a number of key problems and contradictions of social modernization in Russia, mainly two most important ones: the land question, meaning redistribution of agricultural land from big landowners to peasants, and the political question, democratization of the state. This was expressed in the most popular slogan of the Russian revolutionary movement, "Land and Freedom." The revolution included confrontation of various social and political forces in the form of civil war, continued after the downfall of the Tsarist regime till stabilization of the new Bolshevik political regime on the basis of the partial resolution of the land question and cessation of the mass popular struggles. In this context, the Kronstadt Revolt of 1921 appears as an integral part of the revolutionary process that took several years. In order to define its historical place and significance, it is necessary to describe the main phases of the Great Russian Revolution. First, during the February to March 1917 phase, the Tsarist autocracy was destroyed and systematic social transformation began. However, the main question of the revolution had not been solved. Peasants did not receive land, and a democratic political system was not consolidated, since the provisional government delayed a convocation of the Constituent Assembly. The second phase lasted from summer 1917 to the beginning of 1918. It was a time of the new upsurge of the mass social movements, both urban and countryside. Growing disillusionment in the provisional government led masses to rely on Soviets as a basis of a new political system. This created conditions for the taking of power by the Bolshevik Party in October 1917. Though the Bolsheviks had not popular majority support, they did not face mass resistance. The principal content of this October phase was agrarian revolution in the countryside, so-called, quote, black repartition, end quote, of land among peasants sanctioned by the new authorities. The third phase, from summer 1918 to the end of 1920, was a period of large-scale civil war. The precondition of it became mass disillusionment in the Bolsheviks, who also proved unable to resolve main questions of the revolution. In place of Soviet power, they established an authoritarian Communist Party rule. In place of freedom for the peasantry came the, quote, food dictatorship, system of grain requisitions. This enabled consolidation of the anti-Bolshevik right-wing counter-revolutionary forces, the White Movement with its large armies supported by foreign states. During the large-scale military confrontation between Reds and Whites, the popular mass movement for land and freedom manifested itself mostly in the form of resistance to both dictatorships. Local uprisings, guerrilla warfare, and so on. In general, this stage can be called the defensive phase of the revolution. Under its conditions, popular movements had to act carefully, since struggle against one of the combating dictatorships could play to the hands of the other. But finally, the Whites, with their restorationist aspirations, proved to be worse for the majority of the population than the Reds, and that explains defeat of the former by the end of 1920. However, the main questions of the revolution still remained unresolved, leading to the new rise of popular struggles, the fourth phase of the revolutionary process's development. This period of the new revolutionary upsurge lasted from the end of 1920 to March 1921, and one of its most important episodes became the revolt of the Kronstadt sailors. It should be seen in the closest relation with the other events of this phase. Firstly, the winter of 1920 to 1921 marked the highest point of the peasant war in Russia. Mass peasant uprisings engulfed all grain-producing regions. At least 165 large insurgent detachments with more than 100,000 fighters operated in the country. In Tambov region, the, quote, United Guerrilla Army, led by a socialist revolutionary, Alexander Antonov, counted about 50,000. The same number of insurgents fought in, quote, popular armies of Western Siberia under the slogan, quote, down with communism, long live Soviets, end quote, took several towns. Most of the countryside territory all over the country went out of control of the Moscow government. Secondly, there was an upsurge of industrial workers' protest movements everywhere. In all main industrial centers of Russia, workers went on strikes that very often involved putting forward political demands. In Petrograd, the protest movement had reached by the end of February 1921 such a scale that Bolshevik authorities called it, quote, mutiny at factories, and declared martial law in Petrograd. It was the February mighty strike wave in both capitals, Petrograd and Moscow, that directly provoked the Kronstadt Revolt. Thirdly, a whole series of protest actions, including armed rebellions, took place in the Red Army that consisted of the same peasants and workers. In the Volga region, the rebellious division commander, Alexander Sapazkov, formed the, quote, First Red Army of Truth, end quote. In Ukraine, rebelled a commander of the cavalry brigade, Grigory Mazlikov, who with his men joined, quote, the Revolutionary Insurgent Army, led by anarchist Nestor Makhno, and there were others. From the standpoint of political theory, the situation of early 1921 could be described as a revolutionary situation. The notion was introduced by Vladimir Lenin, but before him a set of conditions for beginning of revolutions has been characterized by such historians as Adolphe Thiers and François Mignet. They also identified these conditions in the episodes of revolutionary processes activation in the framework of the Great French Revolution of 1789 to 1795. Just as a side note, this essay, I don't know if it was looked over before it was put online, because it's kind of like it has a lot of like grammatical problems. I promise you I can read. It's the text, I promise. I'm not illiterate. Another French historian, Alexei de Tocqueville, looking at the situations of the revolutionary upsurges, noted that they develop when masses feel their growing expectations for improvements betrayed. It was exactly the case after the defeat of the last large white army of Peter Wrangel in November 1920. The Civil War front came to an end and people hoped for the liquidation of war communism, the regime of food requisitioning, suppression of trade, militarization of economy, and compulsory labor. The policy of war communism obviously came to a deadlock, blocking any development of the ruined economy and generating hunger. But the communist authorities, instead of abandoning war communism, tried to tighten the screws of war communism more and more. This caused a rise in protest activities, stimulated by popular understanding that there was no more direct threat of armed white counter-revolution that could use such actions for its advantage. Lenin defined a revolutionary situation as a situation of general crisis, when, quote, the suffering and want, end quote, of the masses, quote, have grown more acute than usual, end quote, and they considerably increase their activity. In other words, the principal factor leading to a revolution is that, quote, the lower classes do not want to live in the old way, end quote. The modern theories of revolution, developed by such authors as Olivier Feuillée and Michel Dobry and others, concretize this property of the revolutionary situation by identifying its three characteristics. 1. active protest involving a significant percentage of the population. As we have seen, this feature was present in Russia in early 1921. 2. Large interclass coalitions are formed, which led to the spread of the protest movement. In the case of Russia in 1921, there was a spontaneous forming coalition between insurgent peasants, striking workers, and rebelling soldiers and sailors. 3. Universalization of basic demands of the protesting masses. In 1921, such common demands put forward in protest of all social groups were, quote, the three freedoms of labor, of trade, and political freedom. People demanded free disposal of their labor power, free trade unions, free exchange between cities and countryside, free speech, press meetings, and associations. They wanted free elections of workers, peasants, and soldiers Soviets that from mid-1918 had been tightly controlled by the ruling Communist Party that determined their results. In the Leninist conception of the proletarian dictatorship that equated it with the dictatorship of the Communist Party, Soviets, as well as unions and other public organizations, were seen as nothing more than transition belts, quote, transition belts, from the ruling party to masses. Their independence or possibility of oppositional behavior was totally excluded. As Leon Kamenev declared in 1920, commenting on the results of elections to the Moscow Soviet, over which Kamenev presided, the socialist political opposition, he meant Mensheviks in particular, would not be allowed to get even, quote, a particle of power, end quote. As Lenin himself put it, no, quote, slightest shift of power, end quote, from the Bolsheviks was tolerable. But many workers and peasants did not forget that the October 1917 Bolshevik slogan was all power to the Soviets, and not, quote, all power to the Bolshevik Party, and demanded practical fulfillment of that principle. The, quote, 15-point resolution adopted on March 1st, 1921, by the General Meeting of Sailors and Workers of Kronstadt, just summarized the above-mentioned common political, social, and economic popular demands and became the beginning of the rebellion. The next property of a revolutionary situation is a crisis of the The next property of a revolutionary situation is a crisis, quote, of the tops, among ruling elite. In Lenin's words, quote, the upper classes should be unable to rule in the old way, end quote. In the language of contemporary political science, quote, divisions or defections within the central bodies of the state, divisions or defections within security forces, end quote. In 1921, the ruling Bolshevik Party experienced a profound crisis, both on the leadership and rank-and-file levels. Attempts to find a way out of the dead end of war communism led to the bitter, quote, discussion on trade unions that divided even the Central Committee and Politburo of the Russian Communist Party, Bolsheviks, into rival factions. The, quote, workers' opposition and the, quote, democratic centralism group attacked the party tops for being out of touch with the proletarian masses. The factional struggle engulfed also Communist Party organizations of the Baltic Fleet. Petrograd Party leaders around Grigory Zinoviev and the fleet's political commissar, Nikolai Kuzmin, Kuzmin, who supported Lenin's faction, came against the fleet's commander, Theodore Raskolnikov, who belonged to Trotsky's faction and had to resign. Party leaders' credibility among communist sailors diminished. There were talks about possible formation of the new opposition grouping, the, quote, fleet opposition. Influence of the fleet's party cells had fallen. Sailors were leaving the Communist Party en masse. Before the rebellion, the Kronstadt party organization lost about 40% of its members. In the course of rebellion itself, only 1/3 of Kronstadt communists came out of it. 1/3 supported it, and 1/3 stood neutral. Looks like that looks like a mistake. In the course of the rebellion itself, only 1/3 of Kronstadt communists came out against it. 1/3 supported it, and 1/3 stood neutral. The newly elected Provisional Bureau of Kronstadt Organization of the Russian Communist Party called for cooperation with the rebels' Revolutionary Committee. Its members had to be shot by Cheka. And a number of the rebellion's leaders, including head of the Revolutionary Committee, Stepan Petrochenko, were former Communist Party members themselves. They understood their struggle as the struggle for the case of October 1917, with its proclaimed but not realized goals. Later, Raphael Abramovich, Menshevik leader in emigration, characterized the Kronstadt rebellion as an uprising against Bolshevik dictatorship, quote, by a part of Bolshevism itself, end quote. It is not an accident that the leading role at the beginning of the uprising was played by old sailors from the battleships Sebastopol and Petropavlovsk, many of whom participated in revolutionary events in 1917, when Kronstadt served as a main stronghold of Bolshevism. These old sailors were joined by younger conscripts from southern Russia and Ukraine with fresh experiences of war, communism, and the associated repressions. The outcome of the Kronstadt rebellion proved once again that not every revolutionary situation leads to revolution. But had the 1921 uprisings any chances to win? 2.5 years earlier, quite similar events took place not far away from Kronstadt, in the German Baltic seaport of Kiel. In November 1918, a sailors' revolt there led to the formation of the Soldiers' and Workers' Council, similar to the Kronstadt Provisional Revolutionary Committee. The council adopted the, quote, 14-point resolution, the first paragraphs of which resembled those in the 15-point resolution of Kronstadt. Demands of freedom of speech, press, and release of political prisoners. German government troops tried to suppress the Kiel sailors, but failed. Rebels were joined by other soldiers and supported by workers. The movement spread in other cities all over the country, and that sparked a victorious November 1918 democratic revolution in Germany. As in Kiel in 1918, the Kronstadt rebels in 1921 had widespread sympathies among Petrograd workers and sailors, and communist leaders understood a grave danger that workers-sailors coalitions constituted communist leaders understood a grave danger that a workers-sailors coalition constituted for their rule. Nikolai Bukharin even told delegates of the 10th Party Congress that the mutiny in Kronstadt was not so dangerous in comparison with the workers' protest in Petrograd and Moscow, where, quote, petty bourgeois viruses infected a part of the working class with gangrene, end quote. On the 5th of March, Trotsky wrote, only seizure of Kronstadt would end political crisis in Petrograd, end quote. Zinoviev sent panic letters to Moscow saying that the only reliable forces in Petrograd were 5,000 military cadets and armed communists. On March 10th, Mikhail Tukhachevsky, commander of the 7th Army, directed against Kronstadt, also urged about a possible workers' uprising in Petrograd and stressed a necessity to move more troops into the northern capital to prevent it. Many Red Army soldiers refused to fight against the Kronstadt rebels. It was the main reason why the first assault on Kronstadt on March 8th failed. Some units, such as the 561st Regiment, did not obey orders to attack. Others, as it was reported, stopped when they saw red flags over Kronstadt. Communist propaganda told that the naval base was in the hands of counter-revolutionaries, white generals, and black 100s. Then the military command brought against the rebels one of the best rifle divisions of the Red Army, the 27th Omsk Division. It distinguishes itself as a force that played an important role in defeating the White Army of Alexander Kolchak in Siberia. But now this veteran unit proved to be unreliable. Several of its regiments adopted resolutions stating that they would not, quote, go against our brothers in Kronstadt, end quote. These units have been disarmed, those who protested arrested. Quote, extraordinary troikas, courts of 3 judges, were formed to issue death sentences for those who refused to attack Kronstadt. Only in 2 days, March 14th and 15th, about 800 Red Army soldiers were shot by decisions of the troikas. During the Great Terror of the 1930s, the Institute of Troika was used on a mass scale by Stalin. So, Wendelin Thomas, who in November 1918 took part in the Sailors' Revolt in Germany, and in 1937 participated in the International, quote, Commission of the Inquiry into the charges made against Leon Trotsky in the Moscow trials, the Dewey Commission, it's the Dewey Commission, had good reason to point at the link between Kronstadt's suppression and the development of the Stalinist regime's repressive tactics. Thus, in March 1921, it was very difficult to prevent spreading the uprising out of Kronstadt. And the soon expected melting of ice around Kronstadt could have made it an impregnable fortress. Linking together with Baltic Fleet sailors, striking workers, and insurgent peasants could have transformed the political regime in Russia. Their victory would have meant democratization of the country's political system and giving peasants, quote, full freedom of action in regard to their land, end quote, as the, quote, 15-point resolution put it. That would have meant final resolutions of both the main questions of the Great Russian Revolution, agrarian and political. But that did not happen. The Kronstadt Revolt of 1921 suffered defeat. Several factors contributed to such an outcome. Among those factors, the spontaneous character of the rebellion that had not been organizationally or politically prepared in advance, and the mostly defensive tactics of the rebels, who for too long a time believed in a possibility of peaceful compromise with the Communist Party leaders. At the same time, political forces that could have supported Sayler's rebellion in Petrograd were neutralized by the preemptive repression. Literally a couple days before the beginning of the revolt, several hundreds of members of socialist parties and activists of independent workers' movement had been arrested by the Petrograd Cheka. However, the Kronstadt Revolt, though defeated, played an important role, together with other popular uprisings and protests, by forcing Bolsheviks to put an end to war communism and introduce the new economic policy in March 1921. Concessions to peasants, transition from food requisitioning to a tax system, restoration of trade, etc., and general loosening of government control over the economy improved the economic situation in the country and led to a decline in mass protest activity. The revolutionary process in Russia entered its final downward phase. In summer 1921, all main centers of peasant insurgency in the Volga region, in western Siberia, and Ukraine were finally suppressed. At the same time, the scale of industrial workers' struggles diminished. This signified the end of the Great Russian Revolution of 1917 to 21. Its objective tasks had been resolved only partially. The peasant majority of the population got real social achievements, but with no political guarantees. The revolution totally failed in its political democratic aspect, leading to the consolidation of new, quote, red forms of authoritarianism. Simultaneously with a certain economic liberalization, the political regime of the Communist Party rule hardened. Communist leaders were threatened by what they called, quote, a spirit of Kronstadt, which could have led to new rebellions. Therefore, by 1922, they not only purged all Soviets of the tiny remnants of legal non-communist opposition, Mensheviks, maximalists, anarchists, but outlawed factions and, quote, unbusinesslike and factional criticism, end quote, inside the ruling Communist Party itself. Lenin said that 1921 marked, quote, the self-thermidorization, end quote, of the Bolshevik regime. If thermidor is understood as a combination of relative economic liberalization with consolidation of oligarchic rule and final suppression of popular movements, Lenin had a point. The 1921 Kronstadt Revolt, with its revolutionary democratic aspirations, was in fact a serious attempt to revive the initial program and slogans of October 1917. Its failure opened a historically known road from Thermidor to Bonapartism that at the 20th that in the 20th century took a form of totalitarianism. As Ante Siliga, active participant of the left anti-Stalinist resistance and Soviet political prisoner in the 1930s, wrote in 1936, quote, "Everything that happened after the suppression of Kronstadt and the worker strike movement in 1921 was, from the social point of view, no more than evolution, movement from step to step down," end quote. Victor Serge, who had a more positive view of Lenin and Trotsky, tended to see in the suppression of Kronstadt a tragic necessity, and argued about it with Siliga. He nevertheless admitted, quote, "It is the Kronstadt tragedy that we have to look at in order to see how the revolution's image changed. Kronstadt meant the first bloody victory of the bureaucratic state over the laboring masses. The state was still led by great Bolsheviks, ardent and far-sighted socialists, but in fact the machine had already overpowered them, and a habit of unlimited rule without democratic control changed their mentality," end quote. The fate of defeated Kronstadt was sad. More than 2,000 people were shot, and more than 6,000 people imprisoned, and the remaining population, the, quote, "Kron mutineers and their families," end quote, deported. But the Bolshevik victors fared not much better. Zinoviev and Kamenev were shot by Stalin in 1936. Tukhachevsky in 1937. Kuzmin and Bukharin in 1938. Raskolnikov was in 1938 declared, quote, an enemy of the people, refused to return from France to the USSR, and a year later died under suspicious circumstances. Trotsky was in 1940 assassinated in Mexican exile by Stalin's agent. By that time, Trotsky, who in 1921 led the military suppression of the Sailors' Revolt, had put forward a program that, as Siliga pointed out, quote, in fact reproduce, though in timid form, the main demands of Kronstadt, end quote. All of these leading communists eventually became victims of their own 1921 victory that proved to be Pyrrhic. History once again demonstrated those attempting to defend or develop revolution by betraying its basic principles of self-liberation could only bury the revolutionary project and often share its fate too.